Civil War began. Most of the North assumed it would be a quick and easy victory. After the defeat at Bull Run and the subsequent rout of the Union Army, a demoralized Union looked forward toward successful offensive operations against the South. As the weeks dragged into months, a frustrated Lincoln was famously quoted during a meeting with generals, that if General McClellan does not want the use of the Army, I would like to borrow it for a time. Lincoln had also not received a definitive answer from Major General Henry Halleck or Major General Don Carlos Buell, who each commanded an army in the West, as to when they would make a coordinated offensive. After being stonewalled by his generals in the East and West, a rebuffed Lincoln issued General War Order No. 1. The order starts as follows. Order the 22nd day of February, 1862, be the day for a general movement of the land and naval forces of the United States against the insurgent forces. Lincoln hoped by attacking the enemy on multiple fronts, they would not be able to use their interior lines, which was a strength for the South, to reinforce each army by pulling from armies not in action. In a letter to General Buell on January 13th, Lincoln referred to the Battle of Bull Run as a cautionary tale of attacking on just one front. One of the reasons for the Union loss at Bull Run was Patterson's failure to hold Johnston in the Shenandoah Valley. Lincoln's general idea of managing the war was to use their greater numbers to overwhelm the Confederates, and this could only be done by menacing him with superior force at different points at the same time. These orders were directed towards Major General George McClellan, who had two major positions. One was General-in-Chief of the Union Army, which gave him command of the entire Union Army, and the other was Commander of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan wanted to build, train, and amass an army so large that it would overwhelm any army the South brought to battle. He hoped to maneuver past or crush the Confederate armies and take Richmond. Lincoln had to deal not only with the military strategy, but the politics of the war. Before the Battle of Bull Run, most Northerners thought the war would be short. The exception was General Winfield Scott, whose strategy for a gradual asphyxiation of the rebellious states caused him to buck the conventional wisdom that this war would be brief. Scott's strategy called for a blockade of the southern ports, crippling their export economy, and controlling the Mississippi, effectively cutting the South in two. Lincoln needed forward progress, preferably victories against Southern armies, so he could have continued public support, both economic and political. Even Harper's Weekly, which referred to people that wanted instant action after the defeat of Bull Run as weak-minded and limp-backed, printed in January that the work of suppressing the rebellion will begin in earnest. Lincoln realized the longer the war dragged on, without unidentifiable progress towards victory, the less the general American public would support the war. Not only did Lincoln need to please the public, but he also had to show progress with the people's representatives. In December of 1861, as a result of continuing defeats and inactivity, Congress created the Joint Congressional Committee on the Conduct of War. The committee, dominated by radical Republicans, was charged with inquiry into the general conduct of war. This committee grew impatient with McClellan's inactivity. On January 6th, during a meeting with Lincoln, Senator Benjamin Wade, a radical Republican, who was also head of the committee, demanded that Lincoln remove McClellan. Lincoln rejected this demand, but still must have felt the pressure from Congress. Later, Lincoln issued General War Order No. 1 to show his primacy as Commander-in-Chief. The date, February 22nd, of the general movement is George Washington's birthday, and symbolically ties this day to another Commander-in-Chief who forged the Union. Lincoln continued by listing the armies that would be involved in this general movement. The army at and about Fortress Monroe, the Army of the Potomac. This large army, commanded by McClellan, will eventually be transported from Alexandria to Fortress Monroe in mid-March of 1862, a month after Lincoln ordered a general movement. The Army of Western Virginia. The army near Munford, Kentucky. This is the army led by Major General Don Carlos Buell, who had already been given orders, but really more of a suggestion from Lincoln to coordinate with Halleck and press forward. The army and flotilla at Cairo. Cairo was strategically located at the juncture of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, which would be the point of origin in capturing Mississippi. This army was commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant, who reported to Halleck. He would take offensive within days of Lincoln's orders. And naval forces in the Gulf of Mexico be ready for a movement on that day. These naval forces were the ones that would be blockading the South to deny them the open sea and maritime routes of trade with Europe. This force would also conduct operations against the coastlines and the river deltas. Lincoln finishes the order by holding his generals responsible for the prompt execution of the general movement. McClellan, who was recovering from typhoid, must have been infuriated to receive unprecedented orders. that he regarded as interference in operations by the commander-in-chief, who he referred to as ever unworthy of one holding his position. Military strategy should be left to the professionals, such as McClellan, and not to politicians who had little to no experience. Yet he still wrote to Halleck in January 29th, telling him an offensive was very desirable by the 22nd of February, if possible. As much as McClellan may have bristled at his orders, he still intended to follow them, and ordered his men the same. Lincoln, still worried that McClellan would delay in attacking, followed up his initial order with Special War Order No. 1 on January 31st, which ordered the Army of the Potomac to move towards Manassas Junction. Lincoln wanted to ensure the Army of the Potomac was always between the Confederate Army and Washington, D.C. Shortly after the issuance of this order, McClellan submitted a written proposal of his plan to land troops on the Virginia Peninsula, which Lincoln eventually approved as long as enough troops were left to defend Washington. Even after the approval, McClellan was anything but prompt in taking the offensive. Lincoln, who was devastated by the death of his son Willie on February 20th, was still able to keep up correspondence prodding McClellan to attack. He met with McClellan on the 26th and remarked a day later, "The general does not intend to do anything." Lincoln eventually removed McClellan from his post as general-in-chief, but retained him as commander of the Army of the Potomac. This allowed McClellan to focus on his upcoming campaign. This document demonstrates Lincoln's skill in managing war and the politics that invariably surround any war. McClellan was popular in the public and his men, mainly resting on his reputation after winning a few small engagements. By issuing a written order to all of his generals, some such as Grant, who would commence operations immediately, McClellan appeared to still be suffering from a case of the slows. In early February, the Chicago Tribune noted that the public now knows where the responsible head of the army is to be found: the White House. The Peninsula Campaign eventually failed for a myriad of reasons, even though McClellan had an advantage in terms of men and material at the start of the campaign. There would be several Union generals that tried to outmaneuver and overwhelm the Southern armies in Virginia, yet they all failed. According to Harry Williams, Lincoln finally found a general who would employ his strategy, as Grant's master design for 1864 called for an advance of Federal armies all along the line. It was the operation that broke the back of the Confederacy. Grant was able to bring a close to the war because Grant believed the art of war is simple. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and often as you can, and keep moving. Grant took this strategy and applied it to his campaign in Virginia, which eventually culminated in the surrender of Lee at Appomattox.